Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Shady Rose. I am the events and publicity manager here at Lost City Books, and we're so pleased to have you. For those of you who are brand new, Lost City Books is a used, new, and rare bookstore located in Adams Morgan, Washington, D.C. And we have a very carefully curated selection of books of all kinds. So if you have the opportunity to hop over to 18th Street and join us, you'll probably find what you're looking for. And if not, we can find it for you. I'm very pleased to welcome our two guests this evening, Diane Thiel and Carl Marcum, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. Diane is the author of 11 books of poetry and nonfiction, including echolocations and resistance fantasies. Thiel's work has appeared in Poetry, the Hudson Review, the Hopkins Review, and numerous other publications. Her awards include a PEN Award, the Nicholas Roerich Prize, and a Fulbright. Thiel received her undergraduate and graduate degrees from Brown University and has traveled and lived in Europe, South America, Asia, and Australia, working on literary and environmental projects. She is Regents Professor of English and Associate Chair at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and lives in the Sandia Mountain foothills. Carl is a Chicano poet from Tucson, Arizona. He is the author of the collection Q Lazarus, we'll talk about that in a second. And his poems have appeared in the anthologies The Wind Shifts, New Latino Poetry, and Latinx Rising, an anthology of Latinx science fiction and fantasy. He received his MFA from the University of Arizona and was a Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. Marcum has been awarded fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Illinois Arts Council, and the Taos Writers Conference. He served as Canto Mundo Fellow from 2011 to 2015. Marcum taught for many years at DePaul University in Chicago and now lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he is the managing director of a small engineering and environmental consulting firm in the Marcellus Shale. And without anything further, I'd like to welcome you both. Hello.
Hi, thank you for having me.
There we go. Sorry.
Good to be here.
I'm super pleased to have you both. And I know that you have met before, so you might be a little bit more familiar with each other's work than myself or the audience. So can you each tell us a little bit about your respective books and tell us a little bit about kind of why they're important to you and why it was important to create these works?
Well, great, thanks. I had prepared a little something, so I'll sort of be, talking and reading a few notes that I've made for today. But since you had asked to, talk about the origins of the book, it's always such an interesting question because you start thinking like, gosh, what are the origins, of this book? But so thank you so much, Shady Rose, and also to Lost City Books and to Red Hen Press for helping to arrange this reading and discussion. And I'm delighted to be presenting here with Carl, who I know from, we just established it's been quite a while since we've seen each other, and now, seeing each other virtually here. And so one of the major threads of Questions from Outer Space explores the connection between poetry and scientific ideas. And I'm going to focus more on this particular thread in today's discussion, though I think the book also has a really deep engagement with the natural world and reflects dimensions of what I've termed as the expansive wilderness of parenting. So I noticed a little child running behind Carl there, and so I think he's been dealing with some of the expansive wilderness of parenting too. So, but the book has a few different origins, and some of the poems involve an alien perspective, commenting on the world. And in several of these poems, especially in the first section, the speaker is not an earthling and is observing our current world and commenting. And poems like Remotely or Hippocampus, Elliptical Scans from Space, The Factory, Questions from Outer Space, ones like Field Notes from the Biolayer and Spatial Equations use this approach, often imitating a scientific report. And I've incorporated this kind of approach in my teaching sometimes too over the years. And for years, I've asked students to try to step outside themselves and write from the point of view of an outsider in things that I've called my alien anthropology exercises. So the book actually has a few, of my own alien anthropology kind of things that I've asked students to do. So some of the poems in the book might not seem to be as science-based, but they are connected to science in less obvious ways. And in going through the book for the reading, I started thinking that nearly every poem has a significant link to science. So I was trying to look, like what doesn't have a link to science? And the poem that closes the book, for instance, is more about listening to the poems in our everyday lives, but it also ends on the idea of the simplest question opening the world again, which is in fact the way science often operates. The scientific method begins with a question, and rather than thinking that science answers everything, it actually tends to present more questions. So, and sometimes when writing a poem, the action helps us grapple with a philosophical idea. Writing is a process of discovery, and there are a lot of poems in the book that resist the idea of perfection, such as the poem Isn't Poetry All About Perfection? And or a poem called Assimilation, which evokes the forced integration into the machine of the Borg collective. And poetry is not about perfection, and neither is science. And science is so often about making a mistake and then analyzing that mistake. And that is how we discover things, through failure and learning. So raising children over the past 18 years, has made me especially aware of this. And there are poems in the book that are quite funny in the way they use the observations of children and who see things with new eyes as an alien would. And the book makes this connection in various places. Children are natural scientists because they are constantly testing their theories and learning new things. And some of the poems in the book spring directly from a scientific idea. So the first poem in the collection is a good example of this. It plays on the concept of the cells in the body renewing themselves, and explores the idea of how we evolve in terms of our own philosophical and spiritual development. So this one is short, and so I'll read it now to close my introduction. And because in a way, I think this poem kind of introduces the book. And so it's a short poem called Just Before Dawn. The frog in between stages catches our attention early on. Sometimes a photo from a year of change appears and we find something nearly forgotten. Every day our cells renew every 10 years entirely in ways we study but don't completely understand, until one day we notice something has happened. We might still look the same that morning, but all our cells must have finally crossed over, the last ones in the night, in the hours just before dawn. So thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing Carl's introduction.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Cool. Excellent. Thanks, Diane. Okay, my book, which came out almost a year ago today, at Camera Obscura. We share a press, Diane and I, Redhead and Press, out of Pasadena, and they're fantastic.
Here's mine,
love
right? Right, yes.
Yay!
Yes.
And a Camera Obscura was a
way.
long time. Oh, thank you.
Yes.
They were very open to my input with the cover and what I wanted to see. I wanted something really graphic, and they came back with that, and I was like, wow, I couldn't ask for anything better. So Camera Obscura was a long time in the making. My first book came out in 2001, Q Lazarus. And then I went on to start teaching. And one of the things they don't tell you when you start teaching is that you have to carve out time for your writing. And so I went with an approach that I'm going to write in the summers. I'm going to write in the summers. That's my time. And then I had kids, and that changed things quite a bit too. So it was a long time making this book. And I left actually academia for the private sector. I was tired of reading bad poems about dead grandmas and dealing with kids for the most part. It was nice to work with adults, but then you realize that working with adults isn't what it's cracked up to be either. So lately I've become just a poet, just working with myself. But a Camera Obscura takes the idea of the Camera Obscura, the pinhole camera. We've all seen images of this that, you close off a room, you darken it up, and you put the pinhole, and it makes a projection inverse from the outside image that it's pulling in. And I was always really drawn to this. I didn't know why, so I spent a while trying to figure it out. And what it is that it displaces us. It displaces us from something that we're cut off from by just a membrane, really, which is the outside world, and then it's projected inverse into what we see. Strangely enough, that's how the human eye works as well, right? The image from the world is projected upside down upon your retina, and it takes milliseconds for your brain to make that adjustment and turn everything right side up again. And so I was really intrigued by, as something Diane said, the kind of mistakes we make. Mistakes we make in observation, the mistakes we make in comparison, and how sometimes it is those mistakes that really draw out something new in a work. This particular book focuses on the central section of it, focuses on Hubble images. Hubble has been taking images of the universe for the last 30 years, and I had to pick my 6 favorite. And I wrote kind of ekphrastically about the images themselves. What does it mean to see, and I'll read this later, the Horsehead Nebula. Why is it a horse to us? Well, our reference is that animal, and so we see it there by mistake. So these ideas of Gestalt, these ideas of accident, I think, are important, not only in poetry, but in the way you live your life too, right? You learn from accidents. And then, I also focus on family. One of the things that's interesting about the night sky is how little it has actually changed over the course of human history. So we're looking up at roughly the same night sky that our ancestors were. And so that's something that I keep in mind as I write these poems. We're all from different places doing different things, and we're all covered by the same sky. I'd like to read you just one short poem. One of the things that I talked about was displacement, and displacement happens quite often. So, displacement. Starlight's the only cast, the stalwart earth against our spines, aligned amidst the heavens. Lest we not forget that to displace is to supplant by geometrical relation between the initial position of a body and the dark whirls of the mind unspooling in the night. The meander of Andromeda tilts the horizon. We are where we never expected. an eye in its motion, continuous sequencing, indexing, suffusing toward witness. That is to say, the fortunes read in wide and turning skies, what we make believe to be, the ground beneath us, gravity's unshakable faith in falling, which pulls our instinct to the stars as they slowly unravel us.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I know that we have a few viewers already commenting in our chat, so I just want to remind folks that you can ask our authors questions by leaving a comment right underneath the video that you're watching right now. But while you're doing that, viewers, we're going to kind of dive into our conversation here. So I want to talk about, and because I know that you're both obviously different artists and come from different backgrounds, what is the process of writing a poem to you? Because I know that's different for every poet. Some, snatch them out of the air. Some pour over a single stanza for months before they feel like it's finished. So I kind of want a little peek into the internal process of poem writing.
Carl keeps disappearing a little bit.
A second, everything stopped, and I'm back. I didn't hear the question, the initial question. It just kind of froze while Shady was talking.
All right.
The poem, or the question was about the process of writing a poem and the fact that it's very different for every poet. So I'd like sort of a little insight or a peek into what it is that writing a poem looks like for you.
Well, I guess I could start. And sort of, I don't have a pat answer to that because really I think that every poem is just so different, and I don't think there's one particular way like that I get into the writing of a poem. And I think that there are some, and I don't know if this is the same for others, but some poems I feel like, how did that happen? Because it just sort of comes out and there it is. But or I'll be taking a hike or something and feel like, oh, I came back and I immediately wrote down that poem and it was almost entire. And then other poems have taken me 20 years. I don't know if there's something, and then some other little piece comes along and joins it, and and it depends poem by poem, because I do think that there are poems that I have that involve a lot of research, involve a lot of travel, things like that I've done, and then poems that are sort of like just kind of like almost like have a found poem quality of like discovering it, like that you're just sort of stumble upon the poem. So but because I write a lot in form, I enjoy form, even though I do a lot of free verse and experimental things as well. But I also love, going back to some of the, some of these wonderful possibilities of form. And so I think that sometimes those, I find like a poem will like sort of, I'll begin something thinking, oh, this has probably, some kind of repetition keeps happening in here. So maybe this is sort of the great granddaughter of a villanelle or something like that, or so something like that could happen in a poem. But otherwise, and sometimes I think it's going to be something more of a set form, and then it just sort of releases itself and moves away from that. But I really I love working in both really, like, sort of, as I said, very free forms, and also sometimes the challenge of sort of working where you have to just work only within a certain amount of lines or a certain amount of, a certain, metrical pattern or something. And it always really does depend on, poem by poem. So, Carl, what's your process? Oh, you're muted, actually.
My process, whenever we talk about process, and I used to tell this to my students, is that when you talk about process, it's like talking about a hamburger. You know how you like it, you know what you want on it. It doesn't hurt to change things up once in a while, but ultimately it's a kind of personal thing, this idea of process. To peel the layer back on my own process is I sit with an idea for a long time and I mull it over. I will sometimes do a draft, sometimes do a few notes, but when I move to the computer is when I feel like I have something to say, that this poem might actually be one that makes the cut. so to speak, that is good enough. And I know I generally move poem to poem. I try not to premeditate a lot of the things I'm going to write. I think that I did that a lot as a younger writer. I'm like, I'm going to write a poem about Ezra Pound. Then you do, and it's not necessarily open to making the kinds of mistakes that I've learned to make as an older writer. And so I think the important thing is to find out what works for you. What is the productive moment? Is it sitting in a cafe? Is it staying up too late at night? Is it waking up early in the morning? How do you like your hamburger? Throw some guacamole on it from time to time.
I love that. And now I want a hamburger. Let's talk a little bit more about the content of each of your books too. The sort of theme that loosely links them is this sort of wash of science language and references, which is something that personally I have not seen a lot of in the poetry world. And as a huge fan of science writing and also science fiction, it really excites me, I think, to read these poems that are making references to these sort of grand scale ideas of the universe while also being very deeply human. So can we talk about that sort of connecting theme that you share a little bit?
Sure, I'll go first this time. I think what attracts me to the ideas of science is how necessary language becomes for the moment of understanding. You know, we live in this really technologified society, and yet very often we misuse and abuse our greatest invention and our most varied invention, which is a language itself. It's hard to make oneself understood just in a day-to-day basis sometimes. Imagine trying to put a book of poetry together for someone to get a rough idea of what you were thinking. But it's the vocabulary of science that I think drew me in initially, right? The ideas and the way, especially in physics. I think there are definitely poets in physics, because how else do you come up with an idea called a naked singularity? You know? So it's things like that drew me to the science writing part of it, and incorporating some of their vocabulary.
Yes, and I noticed so many correspondences when I was reading your book, Carl, that I was thinking like, oh wow, he's talking about Hubble here, and oh, he's talking about this spatial idea, and I think that I'm drawn to all the questions, and so I think that's why it ended up being called Questions from Outer Space. But there are so many, like sometimes when I'll come across like a scientific idea, I tend to think about it, in terms of science, but then also in terms of there's something personal about it. So when there's a poem in there called The Multiverse, and it's sort of this idea of it plays on, Schrodinger's cat and Oppenheimer's expansion of that and all kinds of ideas. But really, in some ways, it's this personal, because a very personal poem about oh, imagine if, this other self was doing this other thing while this self is sitting here, And so there tends to be this sort of very personal kind of connection with a scientific idea. And I think that I just, whenever my brain sort of, transports me elsewhere via these scientific notions, or like the poem I read with Just Before Dawn, that idea of how our cells are renewing. But what does that mean in terms of who we are, and our identity and things like that. And so, and the way we are, the way we are in the world. So I think that sometimes as science, it pulls me somewhere more personal, and it's like a different way of handling, that material, or handling that, we're talking about who we are and our place in the world and beyond. So.
Absolutely. Let's actually delve a little bit deeper into that too, because I think that many people, when they think of the sciences in whatever form, or they think of the scientific concepts that we know about as a species, right? It tends to be viewed through a lens that's kind of larger than us and very distant from us. But what you're talking about is drawing that in and making it personal and reflecting inwardly about the scale of the universe, which is something that I personally really like to do. Some people think it's a scary hobby, but But I'd love to expand a little bit more on like taking those these very large scale ideas and large scale thought experiments or actual experiments and drawing them inward, making them personal.
Well, I think I might have a response vis-a-vis a poem. This is a piece from the Hubble Meditations, and it is about the Horsehead Nebula, as I mentioned earlier. And so this is just a short piece, but it incorporates ideas of anthropology, the cave paintings in Lascaux and Chauvet, takes ideas of the domestication of the horse and how the horse is incredibly necessary in the way that our society has come together over the last 7, 8, 10,000 years. And I think that that's especially true because even rocket engines are also measured in horsepower. So this is a shortish piece. It's the second poem in a much longer sequence. And if you've ever seen the Horsehead Nebula, you will remember it because you look at it, you go, oh my God, it is a horse. But it's only a horse from here, not from anywhere else. All right, I am just finding it because I'm trying to be more engaged when I'm doing a Zoom reading, because sometimes you look down while you read your poem and then you look back up, and so now I have it on my screen, and so I'm hoping that this will solve my problem or not. Here we go. The Horsehead Nebula. A horse is a thing of such beauty. No one will tire of looking at him, so long as he displays himself in all his splendor. Xenophon, who is a Latin historian. The Horsehead Nebula. Imprinted like a glyph in our minds, a pattern born in trance, the dream of momentum rendered against the sensory void of darkness, pulled into the old earthen cold caves of Lascaux and Chauvet, where shamans ochred their animal visions against stone walls. Imagine the erratum of prehistory, a carved ivory tusk, worn smooth with worry. The Vogelhead horse held close as the tribal spears stalk a herd of dun ponies to spook, stampede toward the hungry luck of gravity and cliff. Imagine the first dim soul sensing the absence of a horse's back, begging for his form. The scamper astride an unwitting beast, the terror and shock, a ruined stalk, frenzy breaks full gallop across the steppes. That moment, horse and rider, tangle of hair and hide, thigh and quarter clench, seismic blurred landscape, thunder and dust, ecrin perfume, lather and panic. In that exchange, two species entwine irrecoverably, a new knot in the strings of theory. And the rider is thrown a day's walk away into a new lack he cannot fill. In the old story, the king's son turns the white-starred head of an unbroken beast toward the sun, soothes him with whispers, elides his shadow. This familiar silhouette, this dearest coincidence, so distilled through mirrors and software that these strange physics cannot help their own resemblance. Astral red fire, the backdrop of cosmos, each star a neuron firing, horse, Queen's Knight and Gambit, black steed, Bucephalus bound toward eternity.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful poem. And, I noticed all those wonderful, you called them acrostic, and that's how I thought of them too, the acrostic poems of the Hubble images. And I don't know if you noticed in my book, I had a few things like that too, but there was one in particular, which since you responded with a poem, I'll share this one that does kind of speak to that too. It's actually a triolet, and in fact is the sort of plays on the idea of how long it takes light to travel. And so what we see in the photographs is actually something that is no longer there. That would have been, what would have been hundreds of thousands of years ago or so. So, and it's elemental trail. Through thousands of light years, travel on, making an album of the stars, each image sent already gone. Through thousands of light years, travel on, recording the ancients, the long elemental trail fused in hours. Through thousands of light years, travel on, our family album in the stars. So I came across something recently where it's sort of like, there's all this stuff about stardust now, and how we are stardust and stardust. Every time I see it, my kids laugh because I say like, hey, they took my idea. Because forever I've been talking about, the stuff of stars and everything. But it's wonderful to think about that, really, because we are. And so, it's when you think about that, it kind of expands your mind in different ways. So, although, we're claiming it as ours too. So but that's what you do when you're a writer is you take these ideas and you kind of, they come through you and they're shaped differently. And so, Carl is writing about a similar topic when we're, kind of carrying this, in different ways in our poems. So.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, Carl, I thought you were going to say something there. Right, so what strikes me the most about the responses that you just gave and the pieces that you just read is that some might say, have elements of spiritualism attached or kind of woven in. And I think that this can be said to be true about a lot of science-based fiction or poetry writing, because it's exploring, if you will, exploring the innate spiritualism of the human being and the innately spiritual act of like reaching out into the stars, right? And I don't know if you agree with that, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that, whether you agree or disagree.
Well, it seems to me that science and religion share one important fact, and that is the necessity of doubt, right? Doubt both in one's own hypotheses, and they say an undoubted faith is not a very strong one. So I focus on that idea of doubt and see the relationship between those two ideas of spirituality and science come together, because, right, it's in that, what's the word I'm looking for here? Moment of lack that I think we're open to seeing something more than we expect to see, be that spiritual or scientific.
Right, and it's I guess it's always hard to talk about spirituality. I think because it's something that, if it's real, it's really personal. That's how I feel about it. And so, but I think that there are different ways that we find our way, in the world. And for some, this sort of like, really thinking about science, thinking about like all this amazing, like the stuff of stars, like I was just saying, it evokes that spirituality. It does, because you at some point, there are no answers really. I mean, you can extrapolate to a certain point, but then past that, there has to be something bigger. There really does. Or, and how so that's why, I think actually a lot of scientists tend to be possibly, more secretly spiritual, but it's something that, that does, in all those questions kind of lead to having that sense of, something greater. and something very greater that really connects us all. And hopefully someday we'll figure out how to handle all that. So,
I don't know. We seem to be stupid as a species. So
we're
see
pretty
if we have the
stupid. We're
planet
pretty
left.
stupid, but there are just moments of grace that remind you, that things are
We gotta
possible.
hope so.
So
We
yeah,
gotta hope so.
right. So because I know, that's the thing. It's like you have to both be aware. I'm always, in fact, I use that where I sort of say, yeah, I'm always like creating buffer things for stupidity, or just like people just not really, being willing to, go any distance and all. So, but then you do in your, you do have these moments, I think, where you do realize that we do have possibilities as a species. We can get beyond some of these things. So I hope
I'm not keeping my fingers crossed, but we'll see
yeah,
how.
yeah. I know, right? But you have children. Really, in children, I think we do see, that light, really. And that's the thing, that's why sometimes I say to, sort of bring it back to writing in a way, like as when we were writing, to tap into some of that innocence, some of that seeing the world with new eyes, seeing all the possibilities, all of that hope. And I think that sometimes, as years go on, we sort of lose some of that. And so when I tell, when I approach a poem, to also bring it back to process, I like to think about, seeing it like, like anew, seeing it with new eyes. So as a child does.
Yeah, it's the last couple of years that I think has made me really cynical. And part of that is being cooped up with my children.
Well, I have a few poems about that in the book. They're not so science and space and time related, but I have one called High Noon at the Remote Corral, so basically, what it's like to sort of, be with your kids 24/7, and basically, handling all of that. So yeah, it kind of sometimes brings out, these, there are
which I see
poke fun at the idea of parenting too, or things that you encounter. It's all not all, that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's very challenging in a lot of ways.
I think that's why it's important to keep our humor, right?
Did you say humor? Yes.
To keep our humor, yeah, both as parents and as citizens, as people.
And with the cynicism.
Otherwise, we'd all be crying. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we'd all be crying if we weren't laughing a little bit.
Right. Absolutely. And that's the thing. That's why some of the, observations and things like that, the alien in my book is making, they're meant to be sort of humorous. They're meant to sort of poke fun at something a little bit so that, we might question what we're doing. There's a poem, Remotely, that sort of talks about all of our remoteness before even this period of time, like sort of leaning, how we what is it, the culture of remotely, things were heading that way long before the virus, is the way it begins. And sort of once they could remotely operate things, every home in remotely had one, so that we kind of increasingly becoming more and more remote, but then what that means and playing on that word remote, in the language. And so yeah.
That brings up one of your poems.
So, pardon? Yes.
The factory poem that you have. It's the first book. But it's you're obviously using a metonymic device there, and I think it's really effective. And I thought it was really funny too.
Thank you. The factory, yeah, that's one of those poems. One of my kids actually said, because it has lines like, it's basically discovering, once they had discovered that wonderful tool to connect the world, and what did we do with it? It became a device to, the line is, selling bodies, bets, packaged ideas with no nutrition. I've read the labels. And so one of my kids said, "Oh, Mom, that poem is about everything you don't like." So, I found that really funny. Well, I guess true, selling bodies, bets, packaged ideas with no nutrition. So, but anyway, but it's a poem that is I think it takes some risks. And I think that you have to do that in poetry too. Just take risks. So that's an example of one of those.
Absolutely, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the role of poetry in, we kind of got into a little aside there about sort of the state of the world and and what role science and spirituality might play in that. But let's talk about the role that poetry plays in sort of the human psyche and how it either can reflect or affect humanity at large.
Well, poetry is dead, though, right? Long live poetry. Poetry has been pronounced dead several times just in the last 20 years. But it is one of our oldest arts, and it uses as its medium, as I said earlier, our most important invention. And I think that who was it that claimed poets are the silent legislatures of the world? Do you remember, Diane? Do you remember that quote?
I know the quote.
It might be William
here, but I'm thinking of it right. Maybe the poet, defense of poetry, and so either Shelley or Spencer, right? But at the unacknowledged legislators of the world.
There we go, the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And I think we do occupy that space. I mean, more philosophy happens in poetry than happens in philosophy these days, which is probably, I don't know, a little hubristic of me to say, but I think it does. And I think that science and engaging with science is an important thing to do as we become almost translators or explainers of some of the ideas that we have. And I think that that's a useful thing for poets to have. And poetry is what Marianne Moore said, if you want it in all its rawness and you want it to be genuine, then you too may like poetry.
Although Marianne Moore, I like that poem too that you're referring to, because she says, poetry, I too dislike it. There are more important things than all this fiddle. And basically the idea of finding the toads, finding the genuine. And I think that brings poetry alive again. And but there are a lot of, that's why there have been all these defenses of poetry written over time, because I think there's this question always of like, what are we doing? What's its purpose? What's its meaning? What does it do? And that, it's good to reflect on that, to think about, the vitality of it and what it brings to the society and what it brings to you as an individual as well.
So with that in mind, what are some reactions that you have had to your work, maybe even these books we're here to discuss today, that have either surprised you or maybe not been what you expected in some way, or on the opposite end, which have confirmed completely the entire purpose of writing the poem, and you felt like, yes, I'm a genius and I'm perfect, everything is great?
Well, I don't know. I kind of, some of my other works, my other books, I found that there was occasionally I would write a poem, and it was really, I think, like a poem I wrote almost like for myself, to get through something, to get over something. So there's a poem I have called The Minefield, which is sort of grappling with some issues with my father. And I think that was a very kind of personal poem, but that became, a kind of signature piece of mine. A lot of people said, oh, I really related to that poem. And, so sometimes you're surprised by that, by something you feel like you were grappling with something very personal, but it really spoke to other people. I mean, you kind of get that sense of, connection with others. And that it's sort of, that one is a poem about like the effect of war and trauma on future generations, how something gets passed down in our responses to things. But I think that this book, since it's so new and it was just born on May 24th, meaning it's just been released. I haven't had that many reactions yet, but that would surprise me. But people have said they've really enjoyed the some poems that I almost felt like, I don't know if these should go in here, because they're so, because I was, there was something really, I would always call them like really experimental in the sense of, those poems of, they're like in conversation with things that my children said when they were younger, or really things that became kind of wise, like sort of discussing arm's length and saying, like, how far is that? Their arm, your arm, or both? And so things like that, where I was like, it's a really, beautiful comment, and kind of using that and playing it. So that there's a section of the book that has a kind of call and response, or involves a kind of deep listening. And so some of those, I've had some really great reactions to those, and I wasn't really sure, when you're not sure, like if something should go into a book, but you kind of feel like, I'm really glad, because it's sort of, I think it evokes a lot of like the natural process of poetry, which is really listening to the world and kind of the things you don't, that arrive when you don't expect them. So that's been a really nice, process in this book so far. But I haven't had too many reactions because it's so new. It's a newborn. Okay, right.
There are at least a couple of pieces that are anthologized from this particular collection of poetry that were big hits when they were anthologized before they became part of the collection. That would be a sci-fi coup and a science fiction in this particular book. And I wrote those very much for myself. I took this idea of the haiku, and I'm like, I'm gonna make this a science fiction haiku. And I just kept adding haikus to it. And once I had a few of them, I went through and organized it into an actual poem. And it's always surprised me how much people enjoy them. And I think they're funny. I wrote them to be funny. So.
Yeah, I liked your haiku series, and I like that. I like that form too. I have a haiku series in the book also. So
I know it's funny how many correspondences there are.
I know, right? I was saying that to Carlin in an email, just that I've seen so many correspondences here. It's very interesting, because we even though we know each other, we haven't corresponded.
Yeah, I haven't seen you since 2005.
I know, exactly.
Astounding. So thank you for that also. And with a few minutes left, if you each would like to choose another poem or to share with our audience, I would love to hear a couple more. And I'll also remind our viewers, we've got a bunch of comments here, but no one has asked a question just yet. So if you're watching right now and you have a question, you can type it into the comments below, and we'll get to that at the end.
Shall I read one? You read one? I read one? Here, something like that?
Go ahead. I mean, your book is newer.
Okay. Let's see. I'm wondering which one I should read. This one is less about science, really. But I enjoy reading this poem because it kind of reflects an aspect of my own childhood and something that I've written about extensively in previous books. But it does also bring in the strange scientific references of the Far Side comics, which sort of, I know that most people enjoy the Far Side, but in the end, the poem, I think, expresses how vital communication is, especially in situations where it can be more challenging to create bridges. So I'm going to share the farthest side. Some afternoons in the small space of time between my coming home from school and his heading off to work, second shift and maybe some of third, what did I know of those austere days? My father would have a question waiting for me. We couldn't usually find a way to get beyond all the history that divided us, that kept us far from each other for such a small house. But when I came home, he would sometimes have the paper open to the far side, usually one that went a bit further over the edge. I would ask if I understood this one. We had our dark favorites that were fairly clear: the engorged snake stuck in the crib with a teddy bear, the spider web at the bottom of the slide. If we pull this off, we'll eat like kings. But the fact that he asked me, even back then, about the more complicated ones, believing I would know about natural selection, space, modern art, or poetry, meant more to me than I would have admitted, more than I even realized at the time. When we talked about cow poetry, It went beyond the cows damming the electric fence. The pilots wondering what a mountain goat was doing in that cloud bank ahead brought us to the moment outside the frame. Maybe Larson intended that a few of these, like the meat in the bowl on the window table, or cow tools with its unrecognizable objects, would resist any quick interpretation and just get people talking. Thanks.
Cool. I will respond with the first poem in my collection, which is it's a 4-poem sequence, and it's broken up across the book itself. They're the first couple of poems in the first section and the first couple of poems in the last section. And they're called Blind Contours, Night Sky. They all share the same title, and they're just numbered. So this is Blind Contour, Night Sky, number 1. And Blind Contour takes an idea that's more praxis in the visual arts, and that is drawing something and not looking at what your hand is doing. And I'm like, well, how does a poet go about doing something like that? And this is my idea. Blind Contours, Night Sky, number 1. Tonight, the heavens murmur their promise, bright and distant violence. And you've driven a switchback road out past jagged, small mountains that border west this small and jagged town, where your heart's consecutive failures have been as carefully charted as the codex of stars, folded in, out, and tucked away in your breast pocket. Because tonight you hate yourself for being lonely. Recline against hood and windshield, dark and parked and gazing. Because this is all you know. Because you misbelieve. Because you mistake yourself for ancient, vision unveiled by Sawaro's yearning skyward, arms beckoning the gauzy rhythm of dust and stars as the stun and halo of headlights fade from your eyes' edges, though you're still left dark and wandering. Apogee begins to focus. Betelgeuse, Rizel, arm and leg of Orion, his belt, those diamond seams, and you forget why it is he stalks the skies. Draw your eyes back. See the night for all her breadth when coyotes ring their pale and petty arguments. And catch now, peripherally, a streaking light, an acute and failing angle earthward, all atmosphere and friction, a brilliant production, a meteor, you know, milliseconds away from smoldering it. And because it may amount to nothing, the quintessence of dust, cast that well-worn wish.
Thank you, Carl. I'm going to share one more short one. This is sort of I don't know, this is a poem that in some ways kind of closes some of our discussion or you know, like maybe brings together like my own childhood, parenting, travel, discovery, science, and spirituality. And the poem actually looks at the different ways the moon appears in the northern and the southern hemisphere, but is also, as you'll be able to tell, decidedly personal. So it's called Outback. I was grown before I knew the moon, waxed and waned in that way, waxed in a D and waned in a C. So since no one ever showed me, I showed my children, probably from the first time we looked at the night sky. Though you might have known this scientifically, sometimes you have to go to the other side of the world, travel through the outback, feeling small again and far away, before you discover the moon waxes and wanes somewhere else in the opposite way.
Yeah, that I love the last moment of that poem. That was one of my favorites in your book.
Well, thank you.
And I'm gonna leave with not a poem from this book, but a poem from what is becoming the next book. I've got more than halfway there now. It's easier when your kids are older to write. I found that I wrote a lot of sonnets when my kids were younger. But this is a poem, and I do drop a couple of F-bombs, but they're worth it. It's called A Simulation Theory. The idea that we are living in a simulation is rather popular these days. But if you listen to the scientists, it's really a 1 in 3 chance. So there's a lot of illusions in this. And if you don't get them all, that's cool. I can explain them to you via email at some point. A simulation theory. So reinstall the great filter into your mask and rescue the Kobayashi Maru. Pew, pew, pew. Fat chance. Engage the neutral scales of matrices and meanwhiles. A slow dribbler up the grass toward third. How the third baseman scooped, slipped, and fired like fallen rain. How the tall first baseman snagged the high throw. Probably, maybe, we'll see, or not. What's behind door number 3? My lucky number is Friday, so inexact. Is there a PhD in the house? A volunteer then? Lucky you. Of the 14,605 possible futures, this is the one you bought tickets to. What a maroon. If I hit at a 333 clip, would you trade me for a poet to be named later? End of the chain and a padlock. What a crock, a period piece, lots of nostalgic pants and glasses, the lights, the flashes, the ashes of what once was. Real, recognize real. Some deal, huh? Here's the base assumption. Only metaphor is attached at the eyes, and eyes attached to the visual cortex, the cortex plugged into the couch and blind as a watchmaker. Booyah. What's for supper then? A fitness outcome for fucking is fucking again. Hasn't the light filtering into your room reminded you of your lover patting barefoot across the tile? Aren't you thirsty? Haven't you said yes, yes, yes?
Thank you. Thank you both.
So there's a lot in that poem, but hopefully some of you got some of it.
Definitely the kind of poem to read through a couple dozen times before. But as we're speaking of time, we're getting close to wrapping up. We do have a question from our audience for both of you, from Justin, who asks, what are your thoughts about SFPA, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association, if any?
I did not know such a place existed.
I didn't really know such a place existed either, but I do. I mean, I love many things that bring together different genres, and and I think that there's such a place for science fiction in all different areas, and I really like those kind of connections. And there's a lot of in Carl's work and in my work, a lot of science fiction in there too, like the sort of references to various classic films, things like that, and series and all. So I think I'll look into it. Right.
As long as we get to watch the new Star Trek at every meeting, that would be fine by me.
I think that's a fair requirement.
There are Star Trek references in mine.
Yeah.
Right, they're a little sometimes subtle, and sometimes they're like there's the poem Assimilation, which
which references the board.
Yes, and it has
resistance
a very
is futile. I like how you resisted saying resistance is futile.
Well, it sort of has a line from one of my kids commenting, well, there's nothing funny about the Borg, and he says, it's funny that they always say the same thing. So anyway, so if you any beings you encounter who keep saying the same thing, you might have to think, well, so right, maybe you can mix it up occasionally. So but it was interesting, sort of like one of those just young comments, but also wise.
Yeah, there's something I think really risky, and they don't know they're being risky with young people and young writers especially. They just do it, and you go, wow. Let's see if we can mold that, because you really have the thing that's hard to find. The other stuff you can learn how to do.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation. I'm so honored to have had the opportunity to speak with you. I deeply enjoyed both of your books. As a big sci-fi fan myself, and also a big proponent to integrating science into more artistic platforms. These were just very deeply enjoyable to me. So thank you for that. Let's close it up too with letting our viewers know where they can keep up with you and your work, and how we can follow you.
You can follow me on Twitter at CarlosGringo13. And that's probably the best place to follow me. You can follow me on Instagram too. Just look for Carl Marcum.
And I'm probably one of the last people who isn't on Twitter. Okay. I do have a web page. You can see all, updates, reviews I post, things like that. It's Diane Thiel, my name, dianetheil.net. So just pretty simple and easy to find. You can contact me there too. And I might actually at some point do more social media, but if you read my book, you might get a sense also of like my resistance to that. If I do it, I'm going to do it in a very careful way, I think, and very, sort of trying to keep hold of who I am at this point, while also sort of expanding things in other ways. So I and I encourage others who are, too much on social media to sort of, scale it back a little bit. So I'll, maybe there's a kind of balance we can get to. But anyway, so yes, so just, check me out on my webpage, and I usually put updates and things like that. So, although I use Twitter in other ways too. So Red Hen is great about posting things when like reviews or things that are going on with the you found that, Carl? Yeah. So.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment. Red Hen is really good. Red Hen is really good about looking ahead, and having all our reviews one place, having some of our recent presentations of the book. I had a piece that was published in WPSU does a poem moment, and they used one of the pieces from a Camera Obscura for it, and there's a link to that too. It's great to work with them, and I really value the relationship I've cultivated with Red Hen.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you, of course, to Red Hen for bringing you both my way. I hope you all have a great evening, and viewers at home, I hope you do too. And there's one particular commenter who really wants to tell you about sci-fi and everything. So hopefully that person can find you based on the information you just gave, and share those thoughts as well.
Great.
Thank you, Shady.
Well, thank you so much, Shady.
Great. Thank you for hosting this and for asking us such thought-provoking questions.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone at Lost City.